Okay, great. And okay, sound good on this? All right, so we have a very simple agenda today. I'll do a quick introduction of myself, my background, and then we'll get right into the problem, which is how do we get relational data into MarkLogic, a little bit of why we want to do that as well. And then I'll go through 3 demonstrations of how to do that. So my background, again, my name is Rob Rudin. I've been a solutions architect with MarkLogic for just over 2 years, and I was a customer prior to that for over 5 years. So maybe like some of you, I had a very traditional Java relational background. I started working with MarkLogic. I thought, what in the world is this thing? Why are we using this? Things went well. I joined the company very much to try to replicate the kind of success that I had as a customer with MarkLogic customers. And I have a GitHub account. The demonstration that I'm going to be going through is available on that. I need to document how to actually set it up and hopefully do that tomorrow or this afternoon or tomorrow, so you can look for it there and run it at home. Okay, so big picture, we've had a lot of talk this week about an operational data hub and the idea of MarkLogic being in the middle and bringing data from many silos into MarkLogic, where we can do a lot more with it with a lot less cost. And I really like this slide, particularly as a former customer. I mean, this is what I really learned about MarkLogic and really came to believe it's such a fantastic technology. It is easy to get data in, it is easy to get data out, and it is 100% trusted. But for this presentation, we're going to focus on that column on the left and go into a bit more detail there. So in terms of getting data in, absolutely, we can take structured data, unstructured data, binaries, PDFs, biometrics, anything that you want, put it into MarkLogic, no problem. We can adapt to changing data. This was something I really grew to appreciate as a customer. We would do new releases every 4 weeks for our users. They would throw new data sets at us, come up with new requirements, realize things they hadn't thought of. And we came to realize changing our data on the fly in production, no big deal. And bringing those new data sets in, no big deal. But there's that point about ingesting data as is. And that's what we're going to talk about in more detail in this presentation, specifically with relational data. And so when we're taking data from these relational silos and bringing it into MarkLogic, the first thing we have to think about is we've got data in tables, rows and columns in our relational database, but we need to get it into documents in MarkLogic. And I think probably everybody's familiar with relational. These are 2-dimensional tables. But documents are a bit different. You can think of them as 3-dimensional. They're hierarchical. We can nest them to as many levels as we want. And it is absolutely true. In fact, you're going to see this in the demonstration, that we can load tables as is. Every row becomes a document. But when we do that, there's a number of benefits I'm going to go over that we miss out on when we just take that kind of 2-dimensional view of rows and create documents based on that same view. So why documents? I like UML a lot, so there's a little bit of UML in this presentation. UML is great for whiteboards, not so much for tools. When we think about the applications that we design for our users, there's conceptual models that we build up. There's normally entities. We talk about customers, products. The kind of applications I built before dealt more with tracking people. And so we would have different relationships between people and other entities. And I have some examples on the right. This is just some basic UML relationships. One would be an association between 2 different persons. One person knows another person, one person works with another person. Both entities have their own life cycle. They live independently of one another. There's also an aggregation. For example, a person can own many cars. So again, still separate life cycles, but the person has his ownership relationship over the car. And then finally, there's a composition relationship where I, as a person, may have many aliases. I own those. Their life cycle is the same as mine. If I delete, if I'm deleted as a person record, all those aliases should be deleted as well. But when we try to model these different and rich relationships in a relational database, we only have one choice, which is we have to put the data into a separate table and do a join. And that might be the right approach to take for some relationships, but it's not for all of them. And we'll see that in the demonstration. And one of the benefits then of this hierarchical model with documents is our physical model can much more closely mirror our conceptual model. So for example, on the right, you can see we have persons that have many aliases, many comments. We have another person document that has kind of a different structure with many hobbies. And we can still have relationships between those documents, but you can see we can have those one-to-many relationships within the documents themselves. We don't need to break them all out into separate tables. And this is really a very simple case of the kind of systems I worked on before, where persons would have dozens of one-to-many relationships with other properties such as aliases, occupations, degrees, things like that. And so you can think all this data is drawn across dozens of tables. Anytime I need to view or update it, there's a lot of complexity and cost there. And so when we start to put data into documents, there's a lot of flexibility that we have with them in MarkLogic as well. One is that we can query the entire database. You can think of MarkLogic as this huge file cabinet, and all your documents can be queried at one time. We don't need to limit it to a single table. We can also group documents into multiple collections. We'll go into detail, a little bit more detail about collections in just a moment. But the key aspect is a document can belong to many collections. It gives us a very flexible way of organizing our documents at a high level. Within one transaction, too, we can insert, update, delete as many documents of as many types as we want, which is very flexible, too. And then finally, maybe the best part about documents in MarkLogic is we can bring in different data sets. We don't need to model them the same way. They can represent similar things, but we can quickly get them into MarkLogic, start searching them, and integrating that data together. And that's a key aspect of the kind of data integration that you've been hearing about all week. Okay, so just to summarize the problem, then we'll move into the demonstration. We want that unified 360 view of our data. We know a lot of our data is in relational databases today, so we need to integrate those silos together. That normally means figuring out how are we going to go from tables to documents. And again, hopefully we see some of the benefits of MarkLogic in documents. Hopefully you've heard of a lot of that this week. So the key question is, how do we really do this? How do we really go from tables to documents? And so what I'm going to use for the demonstration is, if you've ever downloaded MySQL before, you get this Sakila data set that's included in MySQL, and it represents a DVD rental store. And MySQL uses it as a way of showing different features of a relational database and different kinds of associations and relationships. So it's really great for this kind of talk because it shows how do we deal with certain relationships and model them in MarkLogic. And so I've got, this is MySQL's entity relationship diagram. You've probably seen many things like this before. And one point I've come to realize back when I was a customer and when I work with customers today is, sometimes customers will think, oh, we're going to this crazy document database in MarkLogic. We don't need these ERDs anymore. These are still very helpful artifacts for understanding, what does the data look like today? And oftentimes, I just did this a few months ago with a customer. We sat down to look at a new portion of their current Oracle database. And we started with the ERD, and then we said, okay, what are the entities that we actually have within here? What are the different tables that we might merge together to create our entities? So I just want to make the point of, don't think that these ERDs need to be thrown away. They're still very helpful for understanding and analyzing the data that you have and how they might become documents. And I'm actually going to show, for each of the migrations, I'll show a portion of this ERD so we can focus on the tables that we're working with. Okay, so there are two different techniques that we're going to go over here when we talk about going from tables to documents. First, we need to understand what are the data modeling options that we have in MarkLogic. And second is we need to identify entities. I think there's been a lot of very good talk about entities, starting with David's keynote on Tuesday morning. What are the high-level nouns in our system? What are the things that users talk about? Those are typically going to drive the kinds of documents that we have in MarkLogic. So first, kind of a crash course on MarkLogic data modeling. Again, this is a document-oriented database. You can store any kind of data with any structure that you want. And one point I always like to make, this was a big question for me when I started, is the data is actually stored as a compressed binary form on disk. There aren't XML files or JSON files sitting around somewhere. There's not a benefit in terms of, it's going to take less space to use JSON instead of XML. It's all compressed trees on disk. When we store a document in a MarkLogic, similar to a primary key in a relational database, we have a URI for a document instead. And a URI can be any sort of string. It just needs to be unique. And it's scoped to the entire database, not just to a single table. We, of course, don't have tables. And so some tips for URIs is, when I first started working with MarkLogic, and this might be common for some folks making the transition from the relational world, I have, of course, thought, okay, well, I'm going to use sequence numbers. In general, it's probably better to use something like a UUID or some other strategy for generating a URI. One of the benefits is it avoids namespacing problems. If you bring in data sets from different relational databases and you're using sequence IDs from those relational databases, you can easily have conflicts between them. A URI often will look like a path, but there's no requirement to do so. And we'll see in the demonstration, there are patterns that I like to follow in terms of creating a directory-like structure. But again, there's no requirement to do so. It's really a matter of figuring out what are the benefits of having a structure like that for your application. All right, and so we're inserting this document in MarkLogic. We figure out what's our URI going to be. The next things that we can focus on are what are the collections that we want to put this document into. And again, collections not really like a table at all. You can think of a collection as a tag on a document. A document can belong to 0 or many collections. And oftentimes collections are good high-level ways to organize documents by entity type. For example, what's the noun that the entity represents? We could do it by data set. There's a number of use cases for collections. Generally, rule of thumb, I like to have maybe on the order of dozens of collections in an application. Once you start getting into hundreds of thousands or millions, we may want to talk about is that something that would be better representing the document itself. So again, think of collections as high-level buckets for your documents. I mentioned a little bit about directories already. Again, this gives you a way of essentially representing a file system within MarkLogic, and that can have a number of benefits for different applications. You can query by different folders within those path structures. And then finally, when I insert a document, I need to think about security. I say need to. That's a little bit of a lie. You don't really need to. You can cheat and just insert everything with no permissions, and then you're limited to only using the admin level. And I may have done that when I first started working with MarkLogic. And I will recommend, don't do that. We'll see in the demonstration, it's usually good to set up some basic roles and permissions when we start putting data into MarkLogic. And generally, it's good to think about security from the beginning of designing an application too. Okay, so that's some of the data modeling tools and options that we have within MarkLogic. The next thing we're going to do is think through what are the entities within our application, within our conceptual model. So what are those nouns that users talk and ask questions about? And for this data set, for our DVD rental store, some of the questions might be, as a customer, I want to search for films with certain actors in them. Or maybe I want to find a store with a particular film. Or I'm a staff member and I want to find overdue rentals. So those nouns like films, actors, stores, etc. Those are our entities. And what we're going to see is a much closer integration between these entities and the documents we have in MarkLogic, as opposed to having many different tables that we have to break our entities apart into. And again, these are the collections of documents that we'll typically have. All right, so we're going to start migrating data. And this demonstration was created using a slush generator that you heard about. I used a slight variant. One of the nice things about the slush generator is you can start with it and very easily customize it to use different middleware. In this case, I'm actually using a Java middle tier because I'm going to use a Java-based ETL tool to help me out with the extraction and loading into MarkLogic. So this is very similar to the slush generator that Casey talked about this morning. It's just a Java, a Spring Boot middle tier instead of Node. Exact same UI otherwise, though. And the Spring Boot middle tier is going to use Spring Batch to migrate the data. We're going to start with actors and then move on to films, and that'll give us a good way of looking at different relationships and how they end up in MarkLogic. Just a little bit more about Spring Batch. There's many, many commercial and open source tools that you can use for doing this kind of batch-oriented ETL work. I'm using Spring Batch here. I'll just say I think it's a pretty good one. I've used a lot of Spring technologies before. One benefit is because it is Java, it integrates easily with MarkLogic tools. Many of the tools that are outside the core product are Java libraries, such as our Java Client API, Content Pump. So anytime you're using a Java-based ETL, it's a very straightforward matter to integrate MarkLogic tools into it. And then a little bit about the architecture here. It's very simple. We have MySQL over on the left. We're going to have Spring Batch, a little Spring Batch program that we're going to give it a SQL query, and then it's going to read one row at a time. And then I wrote a little bit, very small amount of custom code just to take a row and do a fairly generic strategy of taking column names and creating elements. Nothing fancy. The Spring Batch program will then use the MarkLogic Java client to send an XML document within a batch of documents over to MarkLogic. So nothing fancy here. If you look at some of the commercial ETL tools, one of the main differences is you're typically going to have some sort of GUI that allows you to draw a lot of boxes and arrows to stitch everything together. But underneath the hood, something like this is happening. Okay, so I'm going to start bouncing back and forth between PowerPoint and then IntelliJ, my IDE, and then my web browser to show the data being loaded into an application. So the first entity we're going to do is actors. And actors are very simple in this MySQL database. It's just 4 columns, an ID, a first name and a last name, and then a timestamp. And so we have a very simple query, select from actor. And when we load those actors into MarkLogic, for collections, I'm going to use, again, the entity noun, actor, as a collection. I'm also going to use the data set as a collection as well. For the directory, I'm just going to do a simple one that I normally do by default, which is slash noun slash id.xml, or whatever the extension of the data is that I'm loading. And then for security, this is what I recommend as a general strategy when you're starting off with an application. At least create a reader and a writer role. If you're familiar with our REST API, there's a REST reader and a REST writer role. And I think our documentation encourages you to create roles like this. And then you just put a read permission on and an update permission on. And that's a good foundation. I find that, when we get started, this is good, and then we'll get into some of the customer's more involved requirements with security over time, and we can build on that foundation. Okay, so let me hop over to IntelliJ here. And first I'm going to bring up the application and just show you we have, shrink that a little bit. We have no data right now in the database. And I'm going to hop over to QConsole as well just to show what the raw data view. And so here is the very simple program. Again, this is on GitHub. You can download this and try this yourself. Have to install MySQL first. It's a simple program where I, of course, have to give it my JDBC connection details. What database am I pulling data from? And I need to give it my MarkLogic connection details. What app server in MarkLogic am I going to connect with? And then I have to give it a SQL query. I do need to tell the program what's the root element name, which in this case is going to be actor. And then I tell it what are my permissions and the additional collections that I want as well. Okay? And I'll go up to here and run migrate actors, and then we'll look at what we have in the application. And this will just take a few seconds to run. And now we can go over here. I'll hit refresh. And we'll blow that up a little bit. That's pretty good right there. And so you can see, very similar to what Casey showed this morning, simple search application. I have 200 rows that are now documents from my MySQL database. I have a simple collection facet on the left. I'm going to dive into one of these documents, and then we'll go over to QConsole. And you can see, all I did was take the 4 columns, turn them into XML elements. We're essentially loading the data as is. I'll go into a little bit more detail about that in just a moment. And just to show you what the data looks like in, don't want to spoil that fun right there. I'll do a quick explore here, and you can see the collections and the documents with their URI there. Okay, so nothing complicated so far. Very simple. Just said every column in the row becomes an element name. It's usually a good starting point. If you're not sure what to do, go ahead and do that first. Get the data into MarkLogic, and you can iterate from there. And our collections in particular allow us for bringing additional data sets in. For example, if we got a list of actors from IMDb, we could ingest that with a completely different structure, but put all of those documents in the same actor collection, but maybe a different collection such as IMDb. And I'm sorry, one other point to make about that. Again, we really did load the data as is, as much as possible, right? Row with 4 columns, we now have a document with 4 elements. And my experience has been that does happen. It's probably more the exception than the rule. But one customer that I'm supporting today, we've been working on a data migration for a couple months. There's, I think, well over 100 tables that we're migrating. There are a couple tables that we're doing exactly that for. It's just the nature of that particular entity. There's not any other data that we need to join in. So you will see that happen on a migration. It just tends to be more the exception. So now we're going to get into an entity that's a little bit more interesting. Within this MySQL database, the film data is broken up into several tables. So for whatever reason, the film text is actually in a separate table, so we have a one-to-one there. Language is in a separate table, so we have a one-to-many. And then category, we have a many-to-many relationship. A film can belong to many different categories. And really, when we think of what a film entity is, I think we would conceptually think of all those things belonging to the film, right? A language, a category, a text, those are all properties of the film, and not the sort of things we'd want to break into separate documents. We want to have those all in one nice integrated document so that it's very easy to query, view, and update. And so what we're going to do here is do a SQL query where we join several tables together. The program is going to figure out how to take those multiple rows and compress them down into one document. It's very straightforward to do. And then we'll have these nice consolidated film documents in our database. And we're going to take the same simple strategy that we use for actors as well. In this case, our collections are going to be film and Sakila. The directory is just going to be that same strategy, noun/id.extension. And then we'll use the same security permissions as well. So still pretty simple to get this data over. And let me hop out of here and go over to IntelliJ. And so this time I'm going to run the migrate films program. You can see same connection details. I just have a more complicated SQL query where I'm having to join multiple tables together. And otherwise same permissions and similar collections. So go up here and I'll run that next. And this time we're going to get, there's 1,000 rows in our film table. So we'll give this a few seconds. There we go. And we'll hop over to the search page in the demonstration. And you can see, as you'd expect, in our collection facet, we now have 1,000 film documents. And then our Sakila collection has all 1,200 documents in it as well. I did set up some facets. I didn't know Casey was going to demo it. I wish her computer hadn't frozen. It's very easy to add facets to an application like this. As part of building it, I just defined a couple facets that I thought were interesting for films. And this gives you an example of the things that are very easy to query on and to build facets on now that I've got all this data on one document together. So category facet, as I mentioned in the other presentation, there's an alarming number of NC-17 films that I'll stay away from. And then we have a bucket facet here as well. Based on the length, an integer, what are the different buckets of lengths that we want to categorize our films by. And I'll just hop into the first one here. I'm sorry, let me find a film. I'll do bubble gross. And you can see we now have the film text, the category, and then language have all been copied from the separate tables onto one film document together. And so let's talk through some of the benefits of this document that we have now. So we, again, merged 5 different tables into one document. And I would argue our physical model now much more closely mirrors our conceptual model of what is a film entity and what are its properties, because we're able to store those one-to-many and many-to-many relationships on the document itself. If we want to view or update this document, we don't need to do any joins. You know, I mentioned before, when I first started working with MarkLogic, we had a person record with a few dozen different joins. And prior to that, I had worked with Hibernate and some other object relational mappers. And maybe some of you are familiar with this problem. You know, when I use an object relational mapper, I have to be real careful that I only load the different joins that I want. Otherwise, it could take very long just to bring a person in. And I don't want to bring any data in that I don't want, right? I don't want to incur those unnecessary joins. It can get very complicated. There's a lot of thinking behind Hibernate and tools like that, to figure out, okay, exactly what data do I need in my object graph. I don't have that problem anymore. Now that I've got all the data in one document, it's very quick to load, very quick to view, update, and search by as well. And speaking of searching, now that I've got all these properties within this one entity-based document, very easy to get word query hits on, very easy to build facets like you saw in the application. And then one other point I want to make about this data, you saw for both language and category, we copied the actual string values onto the document. And you're probably familiar with what's often called lookup data within relational databases. That's something that I'm working with one customer today. They have many different lookup tables. And it's common to structure the data like this. You have some sort of foreign key column that then refers to a lookup table that gives you the actual value that users want to work with. But really this model, kind of in the name of being normalized, it's favoring updates instead of searches, right? If I have to do a search, I have to do a join. If the user says, find me anything with English, I have to do a join. And really, how often is that data ever going to be updated? And so it's common practice. Now, we don't always do this. I'm going to get into some of the ideas behind denormalization in the third migration. But for something like lookup data, I normally say start with denormalizing it. In this case, we're going to favor search over update. We've got the actual words, the values on the document, the film document itself. Very easy to index, very easy to query for. And oftentimes those lookup codes, which may be sequence numbers, they might be some just arbitrary number that the customer came up with, those lookup codes just go away. You don't even think about them. You don't carry them over from your relational database. And we have these nice documents instead with real words on them. Okay, so for the third migration, we're going to go back to actors, and we're going to talk about that many-to-many relationship between actors and films, and what do we want to do with that. And this is something I learned early on with MarkLogic, is when we have something like a many-to-many relationship between two entities, when we're wondering, okay, how exactly do we want to model that? We want to start with asking ourselves, what kind of queries are the stakeholders interested in asking about our data. So certainly we'd want to be able to do a search for actor documents and say, find me any actor with the word UMA in them, right? But that's probably something that would be intuitive to a user, is when I do a search on UMA from that top search bar, that I get back all the films that, for example, Uma Thurman has been in, right? And so if I quickly demonstrate that in my application today, go up to the search screen and type in U. One of the features of the slush generator as well is it's very easy to build up this word lexicon. We can index every single word. And so in this case, I'm going to do a search on UMA, and all I get back is the actor document, right? And my users might be like, well, that doesn't make any sense. I want to get back all the films as well. Okay, so this is a case where, similar to how we denormalized our lookup data, this is a scenario where we want to consider denormalizing some of our actor data as well, right? If we take elements such as the first and the last name, for every actor, we put that onto the film document, we can now satisfy the scenario that I just discussed. We can get very efficient word query hits. We could even build facets if we want to as well. This is an area where for maybe other types of questions, we could use semantics as well. That's when we get more into relationships and asking questions like, find me all films with a cast member who has won a Best Actress Oscar. I think in David's keynote on Tuesday showed a very good example of how we could use inferencing to very efficiently answer questions like that. But for this scenario, we're just interested in word query hits, and in order for that to happen, we have to have those words on the document somewhere. Now, when we denormalize the data, these are some of the questions that I've gone through for MarkLogic applications to think about what's the right approach here. Do we denormalize? Do we not denormalize? So first, we want to, of course, start with what are the questions that a user wants to ask. Next, we want to say, for the data that answers those questions, how often is that data going to be updated? And if that data is updated, or when it's updated, how many documents are going to be affected? There's a big difference between if we have to update 100 documents versus we have to update 100 million documents. And also, if we're not going to denormalize, how efficient would a join be? You can absolutely do joins in MarkLogic. You can build custom constraints via our search API. It's a straightforward thing to do. We just need to think about how efficient would that be, maybe do some testing. Also, based on the kind of question we're going to ask, like I mentioned on the last slide, maybe we want to enrich the documents with triple. And this is a question that we can more efficiently answer via Sparkle instead of via our search APIs. And really, above all, get recommendations. This is one of those things where we don't really want developers working in a vacuum and just not thinking through these questions with other engineers and just making their own decisions. If you're working with MarkLogic professional services with our consultants, obviously involve them in these decisions. Stack Overflow is another place where you can go. You don't need to tell us exactly what your data is, but just tell us what are some of the data challenges you're thinking through and what are the pros and cons of denormalizing in your case. Just post a question there, tag it with MarkLogic. There's many of us that watch those and be happy to help. So for this migration, what we're going to do is all the joins we did before, we're also going to join in the actor table and build separate actor elements on the film document. Okay, so I'm going to first wipe out my database here because I'm going to delete the film collection because I want to overwrite or replace all the film documents I had made so far. So if I do a search again on here, we should just have the 200 actor documents. And now I'm going to go to this third migration program. And again, here's the SQL query that joins in our actors. And go up here, and we'll run it. And wait just a few seconds. My computer is fast right now, which is good. Do a refresh. And we now have our 1,000 film documents, but if I type in UMA, I will now get back all of the film documents that the word UMA appears on. And if we look at the data structure for that, you can see we still have all the same film columns that we had from the previous migration, but we've added all of these denormalized actor elements as well. Again, one of the benefits here is we don't need to tell MarkLogic anything about what we're doing. We don't need to prepare some schema ahead of time. We can take this very iterative approach to how we pull data in. So we can start with a very simple approach of as is, load it in, and then figure out, maybe we want to denormalize some data, or maybe we want to start enriching the documents with triples. MarkLogic really embraces that agile iterative approach to doing data migrations. Okay, so just to summarize the three that we had for actors, again, load as is, 1 row per document. For films, a very common technique, merging multiple tables into one entity-based document. I think this should naturally happen time and time again. That should be the most common sort of migration that you find yourself doing from a relational database. And then finally, oftentimes there'll also be a case where we need to denormalize data from one entity document onto another entity document based on the searches that we want to support. Okay, and again, note about taking an iterative approach. So migrations in the real world, I've been on projects before where you install MarkLogic, you get this web app stood up, you start making all these great search apps, you've got visualization, charts, graphs, everybody loves it, and we just sort of forget about the data migration. It can often be not quite as exciting work to do. I absolutely recommend focus on data migrations as soon as possible. Often customers will want to take a data migration as a time to do a lot of data cleanup, maybe things that they haven't been able to do for the past couple of years. They've been afraid of changing their data. I've done data migrations where the customer chooses to implement hundreds of different transformation rules, and those are not the kind of things that you want to postpone doing. Another benefit is the sooner you start migrating real data into your MarkLogic application, the better your MarkLogic application is going to look, and the more that stakeholders are going to be able to buy in to this new system. So again, favor an agile approach to loading data. Migrate some data, test it, verify it, iterate, and just repeat that over and over and over. Very simple thing to do, just as you saw me doing in the demonstration. And then one final demonstration, not a migration, but in the real world, we've got all these data silos, and oftentimes we have BI tools that are talking to them, and tools like Tableau, getting data out, building charts and graphs. And we bring all this data into MarkLogic as part of our data hub, and we now have a question of, well, how are we going to integrate all of those BI tools with MarkLogic? And there's some really exciting news yesterday about the new Optics API and the new SQL support. I do want to show what we have in the product today within MarkLogic 8 and how easy it is to use today. So what I've done in this application is there's an ODBC server. It exposes documents as rows, in this case films, and then we can do some simple SQL queries on that data. And I'm just going to do that via QConsole. So I've got a second tab here, and you can see my query type is SQL instead of JavaScript or XQuery. So I can do a select statement on my films table. And in this case, I've set up a number of columns, or a number of elements. I've set up range indexes for them, and those become columns that I can get in my SQL results and also query on as well. So for example, I can say find me anything with a rating of PG. And so again, very straightforward implementation. Set up an ODBC server, I set up some SQL views, and then I can start doing SQL queries via QConsole or Excel or anything that can connect to my ODBC server. And this is often a frequent question that I get from customers when we talk about going from relational to MarkLogic is many people still have a lot of SQL power users, and they're wondering, well, what am I going to do once a day is into MarkLogic? There are a number of benefits to being able to query the documents as they are in MarkLogic, being able to take advantage of the very rich and powerful indexes we have. But our ODBC and SQL capabilities gives us a way for those analysts to quickly become productive with the data within MarkLogic. Okay, so to summarize, and then we'll move into Q&A. We know our goal. We want to have that unified 360 view of our data. In order to do that, we're almost certainly going to have to copy data from tables into documents. And the two main techniques for that, we want to start by analyzing and identifying our entities, and then design some sort of a data model for those entities. Think through what's our URI strategy going to be, what kind of collections do we want to use, what sort of security permissions. And then, again, don't spend months or even weeks trying to plan this all ahead of time. Start right away with migrating data. Use an ETL tool like Spring Batch or whatever you've got in-house already. Load some data, test it out, iterate, test over and over and over until you've got what you want, which you may get on the very first iteration. And then by following this process, we bring data into MarkLogic. We now have the benefits of documents and an operational, transactional, enterprise NoSQL database. I think I got all the key terms there in that final bullet. So yeah, that's everything. I think if we can get, Carrie, if you have a microphone to pass around, and if you can wait for the microphone just since we're recording this, and we'll have the question. Two questions right over here. Yeah.
What do you think of using different namespaces for different entities?
Okay, so that's a soapbox of mine. I think, let me expand that question a little bit to storing data as JSON and XML. There's a number of pros and cons to think through now that we provide such good support for both in MarkLogic. For me, I often prefer XML for the benefit of namespaces. In this demonstration, I didn't bother with namespaces. For your real applications, my personal preference, I absolutely recommend using namespaces. One of the easy problems to run into is, I'll take the Java language, for example. Anytime I want to use the list class, I have to decide, is that the Java AWT or the Java util list class? And I just feel like maybe in the short run, I'm not going to have a namespace problem. But if we have that grander vision of wanting to integrate many data sets together, we're going to get some sort of vocabulary mismatch, right? What somebody uses the word, maybe Apple for in one context could mean something totally different in another context. Namespaces give us a solution to that. So I should put that into the presentation. Absolutely recommend using namespaces if you're storing the data as XML. And again, I think that's one reason to consider XML.
Does the ODBC SQL connector that you talked about require that you index or provide range index over the things you want to query?
Right, that is a requirement of the SQL support today, and my understanding is via the template extraction approach, there's going to be an alternative strategy to doing that in MarkLogic 9. Yeah.
Excuse me. So, yeah, say for example, the data, just being pushed from the source in a file format, flat file format. How could MarkLogic make sure that the control file or something similar to that, or the metadata file, how does MarkLogic really manage that to make sure that you have the complete data received and you have the full data set and the metadata is really matching? Right.
So in this scenario, it's more maybe we've exported data from a relational database to disk already, like CSV or some sort of delimited format. So in that case, you heard Jane talk about MarkLogic Content Pump this morning. In general, when I have data on disk already, I reach for Content Pump first. So if I were to use Content Pump to ingest all that data, maybe I use a transform with it as well. There's two ways I'm going to be able to answer the question of, did I actually get everything that I wanted into MarkLogic? The first is MarkLogic Content Pump will give me some rudimentary metrics in terms of how many documents were loaded. To me, the second answer is I go right into Q Console and I run some basic queries to verify that the data that I expect to be there is there. An answer from one customer that I consult with is, when we do this big migration from Oracle to MarkLogic, we are basically going to run a number of queries against MarkLogic and spit out a report at the end of the migration. We are using Spring Batch for that, but you could easily, you could easily run Content Pump within a Spring Batch program or any other ETL program, and then at the end of it, run those queries and spit out a report and verify that you have everything you want. That's really leveraging MarkLogic's indexing capability to verify what you have.
So, basically that you really have to run queries to verify what? Is that a manual query run, or you can just...
In our case, what we're going to do is work with the customer and say, what are the questions we need to ask to verify that all of the data has been migrated correctly, which becomes a fairly complicated concept when, as is often the case, the customer isn't really sure what they have in their relational database today. So we're going to agree on some set of queries, and then we're going to automate the running of those as part of the batch program, spit out a report, and that's what we'll do the verification based on. And that is something I've seen done on other migrations back when I was a customer too.
If the question is, can you run them manually, you can run them manually.
Oh yeah, you can always dive into Q Console and do whatever you need.
Thank you.
No.
You just mentioned the Spring Batch, so I wonder why do you call it Spring Batch? Is that related to the framework? Spring?
It is. It is a sub-project from Spring Source, which is now part of Pivotal. So Spring Framework is the core framework, and then there's dozens of child projects. This is a project that I think they started back in the late 2000s that was geared towards batch processing. And it's just one of many tools. Please don't feel like you have to go use Spring Batch for a data migration. There's many tools you can use. It's just a handy one for something like this, again, where it's easy to integrate in our Java-based APIs.
Can the SQL work with the REST endpoint?
So you could, let me clarify that. Are you saying you'd want to stand up a REST endpoint that you could send SQL queries to?
Yeah, or we can use custom REST endpoint and then use the SQL. Can we do that?
Yeah, I'm not hooked onto the internet right now. I think the function is xdmp:/SQL, if that sounds right. Yeah, I've made that endpoint before for that exact reason. So I could do I mean, to get into the nitty-gritty of REST API, so I could have a v1 resources / SQL endpoint, and then I could submit any SQL query that I want and get back data, most likely as JSON in that case. So yeah, the SQL query that I'm doing via QConsole, you definitely have access to the underlying APIs, so you can do it programmatically.
Danny says that's the function name.
Yeah.
With the Spring Batch stuff, are you just converting the query, the results of the query into just a kind of a map, and then mapping that, or,
Yeah.
or would you put that into a Java model, and then, or if you need to do some kind of transformation, would you do it in the Java model, or would you then load as is and maybe do some stuff on the MarkLogic side to, if you're loading as is, you would do the envelope pattern, you would promote to a canonical model that you would then do it on the MarkLogic side?
Yeah, let me give you two answers and also say I couldn't get that kind of detail into a 40-minute time frame, but I love talking about it if anybody wants to get into that kind of nitty-gritty in even more detail afterwards. But let me give you two answers. So what I did for this is Spring Batch has the notion of reading a row into a map structure. And so in this case, you can see the code on GitHub. It's a very simple program that just deals with maps of maps. And then I use a XML API stacks to create an XML document for maps of maps. Very generic, probably the kind of thing that would work well for a POC or a demo. In the, I'll say the consulting world, for example, there's one project I'm supporting today. I strongly recommend going from a JDBC result set to some sort of object model. So in our case, we're building up Java objects. There's a criminal history database, so persons, bookings, court counts, things like that. It makes it much easier to test, much easier to understand. We can write all our transformation code against those Java objects. And then a little bit more detail, we use a library called FreeMarker to write XML documents and then pump all those through the Java client API. And one benefit, I got into this a little bit in the Camel presentation yesterday. One benefit to doing the transforms within the ETL framework is it allows us to do duplicate checking to find out, have we already migrated this record before we even call MarkLogic. So it saves a little bit of work on the MarkLogic end. I feel like that's a good strategy to start with any sort of ETL tool. Take the time to build up that object model. It's going to make your transformations and life a bit easier.
In your example, you are pulling the data out of the database. Do you have any experience with pushing the data using triggers
Well, we would never
or
want to
something
take it
like
out
that?
of MarkLogic and put it in. No, I'm sorry. Yeah, so exporting the data out as triples?
No, the data from the relational database.
Yeah, so if I were going to do that, yeah, so you could take every row and create a triple for every column value in the row, right? Is that what you have in mind?
No. So in your example, you are pulling the data from the relational database using Spring Batch. Do you have any experience with pushing the data from the relational database to MarkLogic so that you have near real-time updates in MarkLogic?
Yeah, so that would be, I did this EAI presentation yesterday. That's more of an EAI use case, which is I'm going to poll a database, and anytime a new row shows up, it's an event that I'm then going to do something and then get the data to MarkLogic. That would be a little bit different use case from doing a big batch migration.
Yeah, I asked the question yesterday and you referred to this talk, so I'm asking it today again.
Okay, that's it for the presentation. We're all done. I don't have firsthand experience doing that. I will say Camel, in fact, I know some of the people in the room are familiar with this. We tried to do big data migrations with Camel initially, and it just wasn't a good fit for it. Camel is very well suited to that use case of look at a table, and anytime a new row shows up, do something about it. But I will say I don't have firsthand experience doing that. But if you Google on Camel SQL or Camel JDBC, you'll get their documentation for how that would work. Yeah.
I sort of have an observation I'd like you to comment on. I see that design a data model row, and it occurs to me that you had a little bit of modeling where you're doing the join to bring things together in relational. Then you're leveraging the relational model. All those columns just showed up automatically, so you've got that model that you just got for free, and then you've got that embedding of the model. It seems very elegant, very powerful. I wanted to comment on how the modeling was minimal or different.
I'll help you out afterwards. Thanks, David.
Yes, thank you. I do PayPal.
Yeah. Okay, PayPal, sure. Yeah. Okay.
Quick follow-up question. Can you have CDC to work with MarkLogic change data capture?
Okay, yeah, that actually came up on Tuesday as well. That was another thing I had to cut out of time. So real world example, the migration that I'm working on a daily basis, we have a 6-hour cutover window. There's no way the full migration is going to fit. So our current plan is we're going to do a migration 30 days out, and then every day after that we're going to do incrementals. We've looked at different ways. So our database doesn't support CDC either. There's no way for us to tell what changed. So it's kind of a worst case scenario. This is an area where I'm hoping to take some of the code that we write and try to put something on GitHub to generalize some of the strategies for solving that. The basic one that we're following is when we take data out and we build that Java object, we're gonna hash it, write it to disk. We're actually just using a Java properties object so far. We may use something like Redis. And then when we run another migration, we have to still do that same work, which is still do the same query, create the Java object, hash its 2-string representation, and then compare it to that properties map. If they're the same, we don't do anything. And it's early on. For what it's worth, the migration still takes an incremental still takes about 2/3 the amount of time that a full migration does, because there's just so much time spent querying the data and getting it out of the Oracle. This is an Oracle RDB instance. But yeah, in the ideal world, your source database is able to tell you what changed. And then life is going to be a lot easier because you only have to process the rows that changed.
Yeah, so I think you kind of started to answer the question I was going to ask, but as you're denormalizing, it seems like there's a lot of opportunity where some of the denormalized table data would change and whatnot, and again, how to capture that. So I think you kind of talked to that, but like, that's one of the biggest pains in data warehousing, business intelligence problems, and I'm new to the MarkLogic world, so do you have any other kind of advice for kind of tracking that and making sure that our extracted data that's shoved into MarkLogic doesn't like get out of touch with the source data over time?
Right. I think Joe mentioned this yesterday in his keynote of doing, or I forget who mentioned this. No, this was in a separate presentation that Wayne and Kaio did, which was doing occasional syncs with a source database in MarkLogic. I had to do that back when I was a customer. We had a third-party product that had an Oracle database underneath the hood, and we'd have to do periodic syncs. It was essentially an ETL problem of going through every row in the source database and just verifying that it was accurately represented in MarkLogic. I guess one benefit I would say of how MarkLogic makes that easier is because MarkLogic has this very powerful search engine built into it, the query side of MarkLogic tends to be fairly easy. But my experience has been that there's just a lot of customer-specific requirements to that sort of a problem. And I don't know, I mean, others can feel free to chime in here. I'm not sure of a better way other than having to write the ETL process to do that checking. I'm not sure how to go beyond custom code for something like that. That's what I've done in the past for what that's worth.
Okay. Sorry guys, we're going to have to call time, but Rob will be around, especially at lunchtime, maybe?
No. I have to get on a plane, but not quite yet.
Yeah.
So
we've got to take a quick 10-minute break to get set up for the next session. I'd quickly grab Rob if I was you.
I will leave
yes.
because I'll leave this so we don't crowd it for the next one.
Yes.
I'll just stand right outside
That'd
here.
be great. Thanks, Rob.
Yeah.
Please fill in your surveys. Feedback is always very important. And
Vibes.
Kerry's just at the door there to grab them on the way out. Thank you.